Could you imagine America without coffee? This is a country where the average person consumes a little over 3 cups of coffee per day. In the 2019 to 2020 season, we consumed 3.3 billion pounds of coffee. But if it wasn't for the events on December 16, 1773, we might not drink coffee at all. Coffee has a very rich history worldwide and in the USA, and nobody really knows the exact origin story before coffee started being shipped all over the globe. We do know that somewhere around the Arabian Peninsula is where coffee was first being cultivated, and then it moved into areas like Egypt and Persia, modern day Turkey, and that's where it really started to take root. You start seeing coffee houses develop, and it starts becoming part of the culture for the people around there. So here's a reading from an historical account of coffee by John Ellis, and this is from 1774. It says, as much is spent in private families in the article of coffee in Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, as in wine in Paris, and relates that it is customary there to ask for money to drink coffee, as in Europe for money to drink your health in wine or beer. So what he's saying here is that coffee is so popular and so embedded into the culture in Constantinople, he's comparing that to wine in Paris. That goes together like bread and butter. It doesn't get any more popular than that. So let's do a quick lesson on what coffee is and where it comes from. So what's happening over here in the Arabian Peninsula is they're harvesting from coffee trees. We call them coffee beans, but it's really seeds inside of little cherries on trees. And so what happens is you harvest those seeds, and then they'll be washed, and they'll be dried, and they'll be waiting, they'll be stored away so that they can be shipped wherever they need to go, and then people will roast them. And when you roast coffee, you start to open that coffee up. What happens is it cracks this first time, cracks a second time. As it's opening up, the chaff breaks off, and that color starts to happen, where you go from something that's gray or green to something that looks brown, black, cinnamon, depending on how far you take that roast. And in the time period, they're roasting coffee very dark. That is what they're looking for, a nice, rich, dark, oily coffee. How does coffee get from the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt into Europe? Well, there are a lot of theories, and I'm not sure that anybody knows the exact one. Some people say it came through Germany first, some people came through Italy first. It eventually lands in France and creates just this huge hub of coffee houses and culture. In Italy, people are afraid to drink it. They're like, this bitter drink must be from the devil, and they actually have to have the Pope come and try it. He really enjoys it, and he says, this can't be from the devil, so go ahead. It's crazy what's happening. It's creating fuss and controversy along the way, but eventually it's accepted to the point by the mid-17th century, London has 300 coffee houses by itself. Let's talk about coffee houses really quickly. Coffee houses became, it's kind of strange, they became these bohemian kind of artistic type headquarters, and they also were these like very intellectual, higher knowledge discourse kind of headquarters. Political discourse was happening. They became known as penny universities at one point because for the cost of a cup of coffee, you could have intellectual discourse and you could learn a lot. You could speak with people that had been places and done things. There was one coffee house in London that I was reading about that was adjacent to a theater, and playwrights would spend time in there. They would have this system on the wall where they would move a plaque, whether a play was good or bad, that was happening across the street as a kind of rating system. So there's all kinds of stuff that's happening in there, but it's never boring. There's always something to talk about. There are always interesting people to talk to, and it's just this hub of creative thinking. In the mid-1600s, coffee comes over to America, and it isn't long before it catches on. People are coming to America from other countries where they're already used to drinking coffee, and if you drink coffee, you know that once you drink coffee, you don't give up coffee. So there's this culture that starts to build here. Coffee houses start happening, but tea is still the #1 drink. And it isn't until tea starts to be encroached upon and taxation comes in that the colonists don't agree with, that coffee starts to boom. In 1769, tea, which is the colonists' favorite beverage, starts to become very heavily taxed. And they're not having it. They don't agree with it. They don't want any part of it. So they start to revolt. They're looking for different hot beverages to replace tea. In just 3 years from 1769, the consumption of tea in the colonies fell from 900,000 pounds to 237,000 pounds. The East India Company was in trouble. What's happening in the colonies now in the early 1770s is we have civil unrest that's beginning. We have coffee houses rising up and people are organizing. They're talking revolution. They are not happy with how things are going, how they're being governed by the British. Meanwhile, the East India Company is hemorrhaging money. They're bleeding and they're having a lot of trouble. So to solve that problem, Parliament passes the Tea Act in 1773. It's not a new tax. It's almost creating a monopoly where you have to, or not necessarily have to, but some folks might not be able to get tea anywhere else. And the East India Company is getting discounts so that they're the #1 tea provider. That doesn't make the colonists happy at all. And there's this powder keg that just blows up. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty snuck on the merchant ships carrying British tea, and they dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the Boston Harbor. This was the first true act of defiance in the Revolutionary War, and from that point on, for the colonists, tea is not had. Coffee is king. This is a journal read from Nicholas Creswell in 1774. There's an election that's happening, and he says the candidates gave the populace a hogshead of toddy, what we call punch in England. In the evening, the returned member gave a ball to the freeholders and gentlemen of the town. This was conducted with great harmony, coffee and chocolate, but no tea. This herb is a disgrace among them at present. Many times in Nicholas Creswell's journal, when he mentions tea in the colonies, he says this is a disgrace, this herb is forbidden here. They are not drinking tea, but he's always drinking chocolate, and he's always drinking coffee. People in this time period were even serving punch in bowls that were made as protests to what was happening with the East India Company, with the taxation, without representation that they felt. They were gathering together at bars and homes, and they were drinking against the king towards revolution. Coffee only continues to rise in popularity in American culture until its peak at post-war 1946, when people are drinking 46 gallons per person in America per year, which is an insane amount of coffee. It eventually plummets a little bit, it falls. Soft drinks come out in the 1970s and it has a big dip, but we always, as a country, are drinking twice as much coffee as tea at 20 gallons per year per person, and tea never really comes above 10 gallons a year per person. Right now in our country in 2023, coffee is booming, and it has been for a while. There are coffee roasters, micro roasters, huge operations starting up all over the place. My wife and I own a coffee roasting company. There are a lot of people who are getting their entire income off of buying, selling, roasting coffee. Now the question is, would any of that have happened if it wasn't for this one night in 1773 when a group of men decided their best mode of protest was to dump tea into the ocean? Can you trace this most popular drink that we have in our country that we consume every day all the way back to events that happened 250, 300 years ago? Can you imagine America without coffee?